Images of Sacrifice, George Sorel and the Power of Myth. Matthew Humphrey, University of Nottingham. One important element to think about, with respect to both ideology and propaganda, is the role and power of myth. You've had an opportunity to listen to Esther Eidenau talk about myths in the time of classical civilization, and the parallels that there may be between that and ideology today. One modern thinker who was fascinated by the role of myth in social and political life was Georges Sorel, who lived from 1847 to 1922. At the time that he wrote his main works, Sorel was a retired civil engineer, and he spent the latter years of his life as an active writer, thinker, and conversationalist in Paris. In 1905, he produced the first of a series of articles in a magazine called Le Mouvement Socialiste, that eventually became the book Reflections on Violence, which was first published in book form in 1908. At the time of writing Reflections, Sorel was particularly influenced by something called anarcho-syndicalism in France, as embodied by a trade union known as the Confédération Générale du Travail, or CGT. The anarcho-syndicalists, like Sorel, despised parliamentary politics and believed that the workers could seize power directly through taking control of the means of production. Through a series of strikes in the first decade of the 20th century, the CGT sought to bring about an end to capitalism. And although Sorel was not directly involved in the syndicalist movement, he believed that it captured what he called what was truly true about Marxism, and he came to believe in the general strike as the most powerful tool of the working class. It was Sorel's belief that at this time France faced a moral crisis. In the wake of the Dreyfus affair, he had become a staunch opponent of the French Third Republic, and in particular of parliamentary socialism. For him, parliamentary politics led to compromise between classes, and this in turn would lead to economic and moral decadence. What was needed was a vigorous separation of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and the pursuit of class war. To this end, Sorel, in his own thinking, brought three different perspectives together in his theory on Reflections on Violence. The first relates to his understanding of Marxism, which, as Jeremy Jennings notes in his excellent introduction to the Cambridge edition of Reflections, Sorel viewed as a form of so-called Manchesterianism. This after the Victorian Manchester liberals, who sought the unfettered development of capitalism. For Sorel, the capitalist economy should be allowed to operate unhindered, for all the cruelties that may inflict on the working class. The bourgeoisie has to be saved from its own moral and economic decadence, and so the workers should respond with what Sorel called black ingratitude to forms of welfare capitalism. The historic mission of the bourgeoisie is to develop the forces of capitalist production to the point where a workers' revolution is feasible, and they will get there all the more quickly if they focus only on the interests of their own class. The second key element in Sorel's thinking is his embrace of the non-rational as the wellspring of human behaviour. And here Sorel was heavily influenced by the works of Henri Bergson and Gustave Le Bon. Sorel was interested in the notion of sacrifice, and wanted to understand why some human beings would quite voluntarily give up their one and only life in the service of what they saw as a great cause. In this regard he was fascinated by the Christian martyrs, whose acts convinced him that sacrifice was not motivated by the rational truth of a religion or philosophy. Nothing, he tells us, could be further from the truth than early Christianity. People commit heroic acts when captured by what he called warmly coloured images that attract the whole of their attention. In other words, by what Sorel now called myth. The third factor in Sorel's thinking is the rejection of what he calls the illusion of progress. Sorel proudly declared himself a pessimist in his social and political philosophy. This is because, on his view, nothing was more politically dangerous than a disappointed optimist. Optimists dream up their utopian visions only to find that real people fail to live up to their expectations. They then extract their revenge. The pessimist is not, quote, subject to the bloodthirsty follies of the optimist driven mad by the unforeseen obstacles that his projects meet. So for Sorel, people are motivated by myths, concepts, notions that capture a complex reality in a single warm vision of the future. Such visions, such as the expectation of the second coming of Christ, are not subject to rational refutation, no one can convince a committed Christian that Christ will not return simply by arguing rationally. Christian belief is faith, not science. What, for the worker, could act like the myth of the second coming? Given his interest and belief in syndicalism, the myth that Sorel hits on is that of the general strike. The belief that the general strike will bring about the end of capitalism and usher in a new socialist era provides an intuitive understanding of Marxism, which for Sorel is the highest form of understanding. The belief in the myth of the general strike will also provide the motivation for workers to make heroic sacrifices. As with the myth of the second coming, no one can rationally dissuade a believer that the general strike will not lead to a new age of producer ethics. Sorel believes that acts of violence will be necessary for the realization of the new society, but he does not mean by this a repeat of the Robespierrean terror, and he does not envisage a massacre of the bourgeoisie. For Sorel, the use of state power to impose a political settlement by violent means is an example of what he called force. This is the bloodthirsty revenge of the disappointed optimist, and is something which he deeply disapproves of. For Sorel, violence can be a progressive and productive means to an end. It can be a wonderful thing, but only if it is placed within an ethical framework that renders it strictly purposeful and delimited in terms of its scope. This brings us back to the Christian martyrs. They were involved in violent acts, but they suffered violence in the name of the great cause. These were the heroic acts that inspired the early Christian followers to keep the faith. The very act of sacrifice proves the validity and truth of the myth. Similarly, Sorel expects workers to be sacrificed in the course of the general strike. Where violent conflict does take place, Sorel places it within a highly idealized notion of warfare. The means of force are limited to what is absolutely necessary to achieve one's objectives, and any prisoners from the opposing side are well treated. Discipline and ethics are absolutely central to Sorel's vision of class warfare. For Sorel, then, we learn that the mythic dimension of politics is absolutely fundamental to ideological struggle. Sorel applies this to a vision of the future, but we might think that it applies equally to foundational myths in, for example, national narratives that help to legitimize certain regimes. For example, think of the myth of the Long March in legitimizing the rule of the Communist Party of China. There is an historical footnote on Sorel that's worth adding here. The hopes of the Second Communist International were shattered by the First World War. The people of Europe flocked to the national flag rather than to the international workers' movement. One of the leading figures of interwar politics to learn the lesson of this was Benito Mussolini. A leading pre-war Italian socialist and editor of the Socialist Party newspaper Avanti, during the war Mussolini switched from an anti to a pro position and was expelled from the Italian Socialist Party. He of course famously went on to found the Italian fascist movement. After the war, he publicly proclaimed that he had learned the most from Sorel, and he maintained faith in Sorel's analysis of human motivations. What the First World War had shown, however, was that the Marxists had effectively alighted on the wrong myth. What really motivated people to heroic acts was not the myth of the general strike, but the myth of the nation, a myth that had the potential to transcend class boundaries. And this is the myth that Mussolini goes on to pursue with the fascist political movement in the interwar period. Now, this association with fascism has always subsequently coloured our understandings of Sorel. But he was a profoundly original and provocative thinker, and his theory of political myth is something that should still command our attention.